The first time I heard the words, I didn't understand them. Memory care, David said like he was ordering coffee. It's safer. I stood at my own kitchen sink in Lakemont, Pennsylvania, my hands in dishwater gone cold, and I watched my older son speak to my younger son over my shoulder as if I wasn't there. Thomas wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the calendar by the fridge, the one with the church bake sales circled in red. They had already decided. And I knew, in the way you know when a storm is walking up your street, that I was about to lose my house. Not because I couldn't live in it. Because they wanted it empty. David stepped closer. He was still handsome in a clean-cut, courthouse kind of way. He'd been a paralegal for 20 years, then a consultant. He liked paperwork because paper doesn't contradict you. Paper can be made to say anything if you press it hard enough. He said, "Mom, you left the stove on again." I hadn't. Thomas swallowed, staring at the calendar like it could defend him. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel, because I needed something to do that wouldn't look like shaking. "I made tea," I said. "The burner was off." David's smile never changed. It was the same smile he used when he told a judge he was just clarifying the record. He glanced at the hallway, at my bedroom, at the locked drawer where I kept the folder. I wondered, suddenly sharply, if he had already found it. He said, "We toured Rosewood Pines. They have activities, nurses, medication management." Medication management. That phrase hit like a hand on my throat. Because I wasn't on anything stronger than a blood pressure pill. Thomas finally looked at me. His eyes were wet, and that made it worse, because it meant he'd rehearsed feeling bad so he could do it anyway. "Mom," he said quietly, "we're not trying to hurt you." I watched his mouth move and realized he was saying words that didn't matter. The decision had been made somewhere I wasn't invited. A meeting, a phone call, a lawyer's office. And it wasn't about my safety. It was about control. I set the dish towel down with a care that felt unnatural. "What did you tell them?" I asked. David tilted his head. "Tell who?" "The place," I said. "The doctor, whoever you've been talking to." Thomas flinched. David's phone buzzed. He checked it, and his eyes flicked up like he'd been caught with candy. He turned the screen away from me. "I have power of attorney," he said, as if that explained everything. I felt the room narrow. "You don't," I said. He didn't blink. "You signed it last year." I stared at him. Last year, I'd signed a medical release form at the hospital after my fall. I remembered the clipboard. I remembered the nurse's ponytail. I remembered Thomas standing too close. I remembered the pen slipping, because my hand hurt. A paper I didn't read, because I trusted my sons. Because I wanted to believe they were still boys who needed me. My tongue felt too thick in my mouth. "I did not sign that," I said. David's smile thinned. "Mom, it's done." Thomas whispered, "Please don't make this hard." Hard. Like I was the problem. Like I was some stubborn old woman, refusing to accept help. I felt the urge to scream, and the shock of it steadied me. Because screaming would give them what they wanted. Proof. I took a slow breath and said, "Show me the document." David's eyes slid away again. "It's at home." This was my home. I heard the refrigerator hum. The clock above the microwave ticked like it was measuring what was left of me. Thomas said, "We'll pack a suitcase today." "A suitcase," I repeated. David reached for my elbow, not rough but certain. The way you move furniture. And in that touch, something old and fierce woke up in me. Not anger. Not yet. A clear understanding. If I went quietly, I might never come back. I stepped back. "I'm calling my lawyer." David's expression changed, just for a second, a quick tightening around the eyes. Then it was gone, and the smile returned. "What lawyer?" he asked. I didn't answer, because if I spoke his name out loud, David would know where to strike. Thomas said softly, "Mom, you don't need to do this." I looked at them, the two men I raised, the the two men who learned how to lie in my living room, and I realized something else. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of paper. And I had some. I didn't say another word. I walked to the phone, and David followed me like a shadow. When I picked up the receiver, his hand closed over it and pressed it back into the cradle. Not violent. Just final. "You're upset," he said. "You'll thank us later." Thomas's voice broke. "Mom, please." I looked at the phone, then at David's hand. Then I looked at the front door. I could run. At 68, with a sore knee and a heart that didn't like surprises, I could still run. But where would I go? And would I come back to a house already emptied? I heard David say, "We have an appointment at 1. An appointment. Like I'd been scheduled like an oil change. I felt something settle inside me. I said, "Fine." Both of them exhaled, like they'd been holding their breath. And I hated them for that relief. I went to my bedroom and opened the closet. I packed slowly, a sweater, underwear, my Bible, my prescription bottle. David stood in the doorway, watching. Thomas hovered behind him, like he couldn't decide if he wanted to protect me or protect himself. When I reached for my jewelry box, David cleared his throat. "Don't take valuables," he said. "They can get stolen." I paused with my hand on the lid. I thought of my wedding ring. My husband Robert's ring, too, in the little velvet pouch. The only thing left of him that mattered. David's eyes stayed on my hands. A warning. I shut the box gently. "Of course," I said. And I left it there. On purpose. Because I needed them to think I was giving up. Because I needed time. In the car, Thomas drove like he was taking me to a hospital, not a facility. David sat in the front passenger seat and kept checking his phone. I sat in the back and watched my neighborhood slide past. The diner where Robert used to buy me lemon pie on Sundays. The courthouse where I'd served jury duty once and sworn to tell the truth. The church where women hugged me after Robert's funeral and said, "You're so strong," like strength was something you chose. A red light caught us near the highway ramp. For a moment, I could have opened the door and stepped out. But David turned and looked at me. His gaze was steady, measuring. And I understood. If I ran, he would tell everyone I was confused. He would show them papers. He would tell them I was a danger. He would become the hero of a story where I was the problem. So I stayed. I let him think he'd won. Rosewood Pines sat on the edge of town like a quiet threat. Brick building, tidy shrubs, a flagpole with a flag that snapped in the wind. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and cinnamon air freshener. A woman named Elaine greeted us. She wore scrubs and a necklace with a small cross. Her smile was practiced, kind but not personal. "Margaret," she said, like my name was a file she'd read. "Yes," I said. David stepped in. "I'm her son, David. This is Thomas." Elaine nodded. "We've been expecting you." Of course they had. She handed David a clipboard. He took it like a man who had been holding it all his life. Elaine looked at me. "Would you like to sit down?" I sat, a chair with vinyl arms cold against my skin. A television played softly in the corner. Daytime court show. A judge scolding someone for unpaid rent. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed. David started signing things. Elaine said, "We just need a few signatures, and then we can get you settled in your room." I watched David's pen scratch across paper, and I understood the survival part of this. Not wilderness. Not snow. Paper. He was building a cage out of forms. I leaned forward, my voice low. "What are you signing?" David didn't look up. "Admissions." Elaine said gently, "Your sons have already completed most of it." I stared at her. "Already," I repeated. She blinked, then smiled again. "It's just to help the process go smoothly." Thomas stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the parking lot as if he might walk out and keep walking until his shame ran out. Elaine slid a page toward me. "Just here, Margaret," she said, acknowledging receipt of the resident handbook. I looked down. The line said, "Resident agrees to placement in memory care as recommended by attending physician." My heart went cold. "I'm not agreeing to that," I said. Elaine's smile wavered. David's pen stopped. Thomas turned quickly. Elaine said, "It's standard." "It's not true," I said. My voice stayed even, but something in the room changed. David leaned back. "Mom, don't." "I'm not in memory care," I said, "and no physician recommended that." Elaine glanced at David, like she wanted him to fix it. He did. He pulled a folded paper from his folder and placed it on the table. A doctor's letterhead. A signature that looked like it had been practiced. He said, "Dr. Hensley evaluated her." I stared at the paper. I'd been to Dr. Hensley once, for a rash. He'd never evaluated my mind. "May I see that?" I asked. David held it just out of reach, then slid it toward Elaine instead. Elaine read it quickly, and her face smoothed out again. She said softly, "Margaret, I know this is hard, but we're here to help you." Help? That word again. I looked at Thomas. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I realized I had to make a decision in that moment that would define the rest of my life. Fight here now, in this lobby, where they could call me agitated and label me a problem. Or wait. Collect proof. Find a way to speak in a room where truth still mattered. A courtroom. I leaned back and picked up the pen. Elaine watched me carefully. David's shoulders loosened. Thomas exhaled. I signed the handbook receipt. Not the memory care agreement. I left that line blank. Elaine didn't notice, or pretended not to. David did notice. His eyes flicked down, and I saw his jaw tighten. But he didn't call it out. Not here. Not yet. Because if he made a scene, he might draw attention. And David hated attention unless he controlled it. Elaine stood. "Let's get you to your room." My room was on the second floor. A small space with a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over a fenced courtyard. The fence was white vinyl. Pretty, if you didn't look too long. A prison can be pretty. Elaine showed me the call button, the bathroom, the schedule for meals and activities. David stood in the doorway like a guard. Thomas lingered behind him. Elaine said, "Family visitation is open from 10 to 7. David nodded. "Good." Elaine left. The door clicked shut behind her. And then it was just us. David walked in and set his folder on the dresser like he owned the room. He said, "You embarrassed us." I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was too firm. "I didn't sign your memory care line," I said. His eyes narrowed. "You will." Thomas said quietly, "David." David ignored him. "We're doing what Dad would have wanted." My throat tightened at Robert's name. "Don't use him," I said. David stepped closer. "Mom, you can't live alone. You've been forgetting things." "I forgot nothing," I said. Thomas shifted. "Mom, you did fall last year." "I fell because the porch step was loose," I said, "and I told you to fix it." David's face hardened. There it was. Not concern. Resentment. He said, "The house is too much for you." I stared at him. "You mean it's too much for you to wait for?" Silence. Thomas's face went pale. David's eyes flashed, then he smiled again. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said, calm as a doctor delivering bad news. "But this is happening." I looked up at him. "Did you already talk to a realtor?" Thomas made a small sound, like a choke. David didn't answer. His silence answered for him. I felt a wave of nausea, slow and thick. My home, my curtains, my kitchen, the tree Robert planted the year Thomas was born. They were already dividing it in their minds. David picked up his folder. "We'll come back tomorrow." Thomas finally spoke. "Mom, we love you." I looked at him. I wanted to say his name the way I used to, when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. But this was a different kind of storm. And he was standing outside my house, holding the door shut. They left. The door clicked again. I sat very still. Then I stood and went to the window. The courtyard below had a bench and a bird feeder. A woman sat alone, staring at her hands. I pressed my fingers against the glass. I didn't cry. Not because I couldn't. Because tears felt like surrender, and I didn't know yet what I could afford. I waited until dinner. I ate meatloaf that tasted like salt and apology. I listened to the other women talk about their grandchildren, their hip surgeries, their church friends who stopped calling. I learned quickly what mattered here. Quiet compliance. The ones who argued got labeled. The ones who asked too many questions got evaluated. After dinner, I went back to my room. I opened my Bible because it was the only thing I'd brought that felt like mine. Inside the back cover, taped carefully, was a folded slip of paper with a phone number. Susan Keller. My attorney. I'd met her at the funeral of a friend. She was younger than me by 15 years, sharp-eyed, with a voice that didn't wobble when she said hard things. 2 months ago, Susan had come to my house. Not because I asked her to. Because I called her after David, helped me organize my bills, and I noticed a bank statement missing. Susan sat at my kitchen table, the same table David now wanted to sell, and she said, "Margaret, tell me what you want." I told her the truth I hadn't told anyone. That I loved my sons. That I didn't trust them. That love and trust had separated slowly, like oil and water. Susan said, "Then we put your wishes in writing and we make it hard to tamper." We changed my will. Not dramatically. Not out of spite. Out of reality. I left the house to be sold, and the proceeds to be split between David and Thomas. Yes. But the savings account, Robert's life insurance, the money I'd quietly grown by clipping coupons and refusing vacations, went into a trust. A trust for my granddaughter, Lily. Thomas's daughter. Because Lily was the only one who called me just to talk. Because Lily had once said, when she was 10, "Grandma, if I ever get big and mean, you tell me." I taped Susan's number into my Bible because I didn't trust my sons not to search my phone. Now, in Rosewood Pines, I sat on the bed and stared at that number. The phone on the nightstand had a sign. For assistance, press 0. I knew pressing 0 would call the front desk. I needed an outside line. I needed privacy. I needed time. And time was the one thing David wouldn't give me. I waited until the hallway went quiet. Then I walked out, slowly, like I was just a woman stretching her legs. A nurse sat at a desk, looking at her computer. I smiled. "Excuse me, dear, is there a pay phone?" She blinked. "A pay phone." "I know," I said softly. "I'm old, humor me." She smiled back a little. "There's a courtesy phone in the lounge." The lounge was empty, except for a man asleep in a recliner, mouth open. The courtesy phone sat on a small table near a fake plant. I picked it up. My hand shook once, then steadied. I dialed Susan Keller's office. It rang. I listened to each ring like it was a footstep coming down a dark hallway. Finally, an answering service. "This is Keller and Associates. If this is an emergency." I spoke quickly, low. "This is Margaret Harlow. I've been placed in Rosewood Pines against my will. My sons claim they have power of attorney. I need to speak to Susan Keller." Silence. Then the operator's voice sharpened. "Mrs. Harlow, are you safe right now?" "As safe as I can be," I said. "Please." "Hold," she said. I held. My heart pounded. I watched the sleeping man's chest rise and fall. Then Susan's voice came on the line, and I nearly lost my control. "Margaret," she said, quiet and alert, Tell me exactly what happened. I told her. Not everything. Just enough. David's claim of POA. The doctor letter. The admission forms. Susan didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Do you have your ID?" "Yes," I whispered, "in my purse." "Do you have your phone?" "No," I said. "David has it." That silence again, the kind that means someone is thinking fast. "Margaret," Susan said, "do you remember signing any power of attorney document?" "I remember signing something at the hospital," I said. "I didn't read it." "All right," she said. "Listen carefully. You need to request in writing a copy of every document they have on you, every admission form, every medical evaluation, every POA they claim to have. You need dates, signatures, witness names." I swallowed. "They won't give it to me." "They have to," she said. "And if they don't, that helps us." Us. The word steadied me. Susan continued. "I'm filing an emergency petition tomorrow morning. We'll ask for a hearing. But Margaret, this is important. Do not get labeled as combative. Stay calm. Ask for things politely. Make them put refusals in writing." I closed my eyes. David is careful. "I know," Susan said. "That's why we're going to be more careful." A sound in the hallway made me turn. Footsteps. I lowered my voice. "He's coming tomorrow." "Then tonight," Susan said, "write down everything you remember. Times, words, who said what, you'll need it for testimony." Testimony. My stomach tightened. I hadn't thought that far yet. Susan said, "Margaret, one more thing. That will be signed. Do you remember who we named as executor?" "You," I whispered. "Yes," she said. "David will not like that." "No," I said. Susan paused. "Margaret, did you tell anyone you changed it?" "No." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." The line clicked. I hung up and stood very still with the phone in my hand. The footsteps passed the lounge. I waited until they faded. Then I walked back to my room like nothing had happened. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote on the back of the resident handbook with a dull pencil from the nightstand. David said, "It's done." Thomas said, "Please don't make this hard." Elaine said, "We've been expecting you." I wrote the date, the time they picked me up, the red light at the highway ramp. I wrote down the way David held the doctor letter out of my reach. I wrote down the memory care line I left blank. Then I stared at the paper and felt the fear shift into something else. A cold, legal kind of focus. Because the truth wasn't enough. It had to be proven. The next morning, David arrived at 10:30 with coffee and a smile. He brought Thomas again, like a witness. They walked into my room, as if visiting a child at summer camp. David held out a paper cup. "Decaf." "I don't want it," I said. His smile held. Thomas glanced around my room, noticing the Bible, the folded paper on the nightstand. He looked away quickly. David said, "We're going to bring you some clothes from home." I nodded. "All right." David studied me. "You seem calmer." "I slept," I lied. He sat in the chair by the window. Thomas stood behind him. David said, "We need you to sign a few more things." I kept my face still. "Like what?" "Financial responsibility forms," David said. "Basic stuff." I said, "I'd like copies of everything you've signed." David's smile faltered. "Why?" "So I understand," I said. Thomas shifted. "Mom." "I want copies," I repeated, still calm. David's eyes hardened. "We'll get them later." "I want them today," I said. David leaned forward. "Mom, don't start." There it was again. Like I was a stubborn appliance. I said softly, "If you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem." Thomas's face tightened. David sat back. "Fine." He stood abruptly, too abruptly, and I felt the air change. "Elaine," he called into the hall. "We need copies of the documents." Elaine appeared in the doorway, her smile a little cautious now. David said, "My mother is requesting copies. Can you print them?" Elaine's eyes flicked to me, then to David, then to Thomas. She said, "I can request them from records." "Do it," David said. Elaine nodded and left. David turned back to me and lowered his voice. "You're being difficult," he said. I met his eyes. "You're being dishonest." Thomas made a small sound. David's face went still, the way it did when he was angry but didn't want anyone to see. He said, "You changed after Dad died." I felt the sting of that. Not because it was true. Because he meant it as a punishment. I said, "I changed when I saw what you became." For a moment, I thought he might slap me. He didn't. He smiled again, thin as paper. He said, "All right." Then he leaned closer and spoke so quietly, I had to strain to hear. "If you keep pushing, Mom, people are going to think you're not well." I didn't answer. Because he was right. Not about my mind. About perception. In places like Rosewood Pines, perception was law. Elaine returned 20 minutes later with a thin stack of photocopies. She handed them to David. Not to me. I watched that choice like a needle sliding into skin. I said, "Those are mine." Elaine's cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harlow. We typically provide them to the responsible party." "The responsible party is me," I said. David held the copies and smiled at Elaine like she'd done well. Thomas stared at the floor. I said, "Elaine, I'm requesting them. Please hand them to me." Elaine hesitated. David's voice sharpened. "Mom, stop, you're upsetting her." I looked at Elaine. Her eyes were uncertain. I understood something in that moment that made my stomach drop. Elaine wasn't cruel. She was afraid. Afraid of the paperwork, afraid of conflict, afraid of losing her job. And an afraid person will do whatever the stronger person tells them. David said, "We'll go over these at home and bring you what you need." I said, "No." David's eyes narrowed. I kept my voice low. "Elaine, if you do not hand me my records, I want it noted in writing that you refused." Elaine's mouth opened, then closed. Thomas said, "Mom, please." I didn't look at him. Elaine took a breath, then stepped forward and held the stack toward me with trembling hands. David's hand shot out and grabbed the top of the papers. For a second, they were split between us like a rope. Elaine froze. Thomas went pale. I didn't pull harder. I simply held. David stared at me, his smile gone now. Then, slowly, he released. The papers fell into my lap. Elaine backed out of the room as if she'd escaped something. Thomas whispered, "Jesus." David sat down again, jaw tight. I looked at the top page. Durable power of attorney. My name. A signature that looked like mine, but not quite. Too smooth. Too practiced. Dated 8 months ago. A witness signature. And a notary seal. I stared at the notary name, Patricia L. Grady. I didn't know her. My hands went cold. David watched my face like he was watching a weather report. He said softly, "See, you signed it." I didn't speak. Because the shock wasn't that it existed. The shock was that it was almost good. Almost believable. And that meant planning. It meant meetings, not spur-of-the-moment mistakes. Thomas's voice cracked. "Mom, you don't remember because..." I cut him off with a glance. I flipped the pages. A physician's statement with Dr. Hensley's letterhead. A cognitive assessment dated 6 months ago. I had never been there. Never. I felt the room tilt, and I steadied myself by pressing the paper flat on my thighs. David said, "We did what we had to do." I looked up slowly. "Did you forge this?" Thomas made a sound like he'd been hit. David didn't flinch. "I facilitated it." "Facilitated," I repeated. He shrugged. "You were grieving, you were vulnerable, you wouldn't have understood." Thomas whispered, "David." David turned his head slightly. Stop. Thomas shut his mouth. And I knew right then which son was dangerous. Not the one who felt guilty. The one who felt entitled. David stood. We're leaving. He looked down at me. Think carefully about what you do next. Then, casually, like he was adjusting a lamp, he reached down and plucked the papers from my lap. I grabbed them. He tightened his grip. Our eyes locked. He spoke so softly I could barely hear. If you accuse me, he said, I will say you're delusional and they will believe me. He yanked the papers free. Thomas didn't move. David tucked the stack back into his folder and walked out. Thomas stayed. He stood in my room like a boy caught in a lie, but he was 43 years old and he'd driven me here. He looked at me with wet eyes. Mom, I didn't know he was going to do all that. I stared at him. You didn't know, I said. He shook his head quickly. He said it was paperwork. He said you agreed. He said you were confused sometimes. I said, did you ever ask me? His mouth trembled. I tried. You didn't, I said. He flinched. I lowered my voice. You watched him take my records out of my lap. Thomas's shoulders sagged. I'm scared of him. That landed like a stone in my chest. Not because it surprised me. Because it confirmed what I'd been refusing to name for years. David had always been the one who decided. Thomas had always been the one who followed. Thomas whispered, what do you want me to do? I looked at him for a long time. I thought of Lily. I thought of my savings. I thought of the will folded in Susan's office file, signed and witnessed and real. I said, bring me my phone. He blinked. I can't, David. I cut him off. You asked what I want, that's what I want. Thomas swallowed. His eyes flicked to the door, like David might be listening from the hallway. Then he nodded, barely. I'll try, he whispered. Don't try, I said. Do it or don't come back. He stared at me, and something hardened in his face. Not anger. Resolve. He nodded again and left. I sat alone in the quiet room, listening to the building breathe. Somewhere down the hall, a woman laughed too loudly at a television joke. Somewhere else, someone called for a nurse. And in my room, I waited for the consequences of what I'd just done. Because you can't threaten a family with truth without something snapping back. At lunchtime, Elaine came by and asked if I wanted to join bingo. Her voice was careful, gentle in a way that felt like walking on thin ice. I said, not today. She nodded and hesitated. Mrs. Harlow, she said softly, your son David asked that we notify him if you become distressed. I looked at her. Did you agree? Elaine's eyes lowered. He's your power of attorney. I said, he may not be. Elaine's lips pressed together. I'm sorry. She left. I sat on the bed and felt the walls close in. If Elaine called him every time I asked a question, I would be fighting with one hand tied. I needed an ally inside this building. Someone who didn't care about David's folder. That afternoon, I went to the courtyard. The fenced courtyard. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves. The woman I'd seen the night before was there again, sitting on the bench, hands folded tight. I walked over slowly. She glanced up wary. Her hair was white and cut short. Her eyes were sharp. I said, may I sit? She nodded once. I sat, leaving space between us. For a moment, we just listened to the birds. Then she said, you're new. Yes, I said. You look like you didn't come willingly, she said. I turned my head slightly. Did you? She gave a small, humorless laugh. No. I studied her face. What's your name? Carolyn, she said. Carolyn Pierce. Margaret Harlow, I said. Carolyn looked at my hands. Your sons. Yes, I said. Carolyn nodded like she already knew the whole story. My niece did it, she said. Told everyone I was forgetful. sold my condo in Clearwater before I even knew it was listed. My stomach clenched. How? Carolyn's eyes stayed on the fence. Paperwork, a doctor who owed her husband a favor, a judge who didn't want to listen to an old woman cry. A judge. The word sat between us. I said quietly, "Did you fight it?" Carolyn's jaw tightened. "I tried." "And?" I asked. She turned to me then, eyes hard. "You better be smarter than I was. You better get proof." I swallowed. "I'm trying." Carolyn watched me for a long moment. Then she said, "They keep records here, not just medical, calls, visitors, complaints." I leaned in slightly. "How do you know?" Carolyn's mouth twitched. "Because I filed complaints. They didn't go anywhere, but they exist." A thought sparked. "Do they record calls?" I asked. "Sometimes," Carolyn said. "Depends, but they log them, who called when." I pictured David taking my phone. I pictured Thomas trying to get it back. And I pictured a log that could show Susan calling me, show my request for records, show David's control. Something measurable. Carolyn said, "You have a lawyer." "Yes," I whispered. "Good," she said. "Don't tell anyone, not staff, not family, not your roommate if you get one." I looked at her. "Do you have anyone?" Carolyn's eyes softened just a fraction. "Not anymore." We sat in silence, the kind that feels like a pact. Then Carolyn said, "If they move you to memory care, you're done." I felt my pulse jump. "Can they?" Carolyn nodded. "All it takes is someone saying you wandered, or you refused medication, or you got aggressive." I thought of David's quiet threat. "People are going to think you're not well." Carolyn stood slowly, joints stiff. "Watch your steps," she said. "They're loose on purpose." I stared at her. "What?" She looked back at me, and her expression was flat. "Accidents happen," she said, "especially when paperwork needs help." Then she walked away, leaving me on the bench with the fence and the birds, and the sudden understanding that survival here wasn't about comfort. It was about staying unbroken long enough to be heard. That evening, Thomas came alone. He looked exhausted. He closed my door behind him carefully. In his hand, he held my phone. My throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe. He held it out like an offering. I took it, and my fingers curled around it as if it were a weapon. Thomas whispered. "I took it from his desk." "Did he see you?" I asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet." I looked up. "He will." Thomas swallowed. "I know." I didn't thank him, because gratitude would soften what needed to stay sharp. I said, "Sit." He sat on the chair, hands clasped between his knees. I unlocked my phone and saw missed calls. 2 from Susan's office. A text from Lily. "Grandma, where are you? Dad says you're resting." My eyes stung. Thomas watched my face like he was waiting for judgment. I typed back to Lily, "I'm okay. I love you. I'll call soon." Then I opened my email. A notification from my bank. A password change request. My heart dropped. I looked up slowly at Thomas. His face drained. "What is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I opened the email details. It had been requested that morning, from an IP address I didn't recognize. David. Of course. He wasn't just trying to move me. He was trying to move money. I felt my hands go cold, then steady. I turned the phone toward Thomas. "Is he doing this?" I asked. Thomas stared, eyes wide. I don't know." "You do know," I said. "You just don't want to say it." Thomas's mouth opened and closed. Finally, he whispered, He told me you had bills unpaid, that he needed to get access to help." I stared at him. "He said you needed help," Thomas repeated, like he was trying to convince himself. I leaned back. This was the moral reckoning part. Not for David. For Thomas. For me too, because I'd raised them. Because I'd excused things. Because I'd let David handle it when Robert got sick. because it was easier to let the competent child lead. And now competence had become control. I said quietly, if he gets into my accounts, he can drain them. Thomas's face crumpled. Mom, I didn't think. No, I said. You didn't, and that's why he uses you. Thomas wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his own tears. He whispered, what do we do? I didn't answer him right away. I called Susan. She picked up on the second ring. Margaret, she said, voice immediate. Are you alone? My son Thomas is here, I said. He brought my phone. Susan's pause was small, careful. All right, put it on speaker, Margaret, if you can do that safely. I did. Susan said, Thomas, this is Susan Keller. Thomas's voice was barely there. Yes. Susan didn't waste time. Thomas, she said, did you know your brother claimed power of attorney over your mother? Thomas whispered. He said she signed it. Susan's voice stayed calm. Have you seen the original document? No, Thomas admitted. Susan said, your mother is telling me she did not knowingly sign it. She is also telling me there may be unauthorized access to her bank accounts. Thomas made a small sound. Susan continued, Thomas, I need you to understand something. If your brother is forging documents and you assist him knowingly, you could be implicated. Thomas's breathing changed. He sounded like a man waking up underwater. I didn't, he whispered. I didn't know. Susan said, then you need to decide what you're going to do now that you do know. Silence. Thomas finally said, what do you need me to do? Susan's answer came like a gavel. Bring me any evidence you can, she said. Texts, emails, photos of documents, names of the notary, the doctor letter, anything. I spoke up. David took the copies. Susan said, then we get them again through formal request. I said, he's trying to get into my accounts. Susan's voice sharpened. Margaret, do you have online access right now? Yes. Change your passwords immediately, she said. Turn on two-factor authentication. If you don't know how, Thomas can do it. Thomas, can you help her do that? Thomas swallowed. Yes. We did it together, sitting in my small room while the hallway hummed outside. I watched Thomas's hands move over my phone. I watched how careful he was, how frightened. And I realized the danger of this moment. If Thomas chose David, he could undo everything as fast as we fixed it. If Thomas chose me, David would come down on him like a hammer. When we finished, Susan said, Margaret, I'm going to file for an emergency guardianship review. I want you in court within the week. My stomach clenched. Court. At my age, court sounded like something that happened to other people. Susan said, you will have to testify. I stared at the wall. I can, I said. Susan's voice softened slightly. I know you can. Then, quietly, she added, Margaret, is there anything about your estate plan your sons might be reacting to? Thomas's head snapped up. I looked at him. His eyes were searching my face. I felt the weight of the secret. I could lie. I could protect him from the knowledge. But Susan needed to understand motive. And Thomas needed to understand what David was really after. I said softly, I changed my will. Thomas's face went blank. Susan didn't react, but I could hear her attention sharpen. Tell me, she said. I made you executor, I told Susan, and I put my savings in trust for Lily. The room went very still. Thomas whispered, what? I met his eyes, because I wanted her protected. Thomas's lips parted, stunned. Susan said calmly, Margaret, when did you do that? 2 months ago, I said. Susan paused. And have you told anyone? No, I said. Thomas stared at me like I'd slapped him. He whispered, so Dad's money. It's not Dad's money, I said, voice low. It's what your father left for me to live on, and what I saved. Thomas's eyes filled again, but now the tears looked like anger too. David doesn't know, he said, more to himself than to me. No, I said. Susan's voice cut in, precise. Margaret, that change may be the catalyst. If David suspects he's not getting what he expects, he may be acting quickly to secure assets now. Thomas swallowed hard. Susan continued. Thomas, if you care about your mother, you need to keep your brother away from her documents and her accounts. Thomas nodded once, jaw tight. Susan said, I will be in touch tomorrow with a hearing date. The call ended. Thomas sat there, breathing shallowly. He stared at the floor. Then he said, You did that behind our backs. I watched him. Yes, I said. His face tightened. Why didn't you tell me? I answered truthfully, because you would have told David. Thomas flinched, as if he'd been struck. He whispered, I wouldn't. I held his gaze. You already did, every time you chose silence, every time you let him speak for you. Thomas's breathing hitched. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, turning his back to me. His shoulders shook once. Then he said, voice rough, You don't trust me at all. I said quietly, I'm trusting you right now. You brought my phone. Thomas turned back, eyes red. I did. Yes, I said. So decide what kind of man you are. Thomas stared at me. For a moment, I saw Robert in his face, the same stubborn jaw. Then I saw David's influence too, the learned habit of bending toward power. Thomas whispered, If David finds out. I know, I said. Thomas nodded slowly, like he was accepting a sentence. He left without hugging me. That hurt more than I expected. The next day, Rosewood Pines felt different. Quieter around me. Staff smiles tighter. Elaine avoided my eyes. At breakfast, 2 women at a nearby table looked at me and then looked away. I felt the judgment. Not spoken, but present. The story had already been written for them. Margaret is difficult. Margaret's sons are trying. Margaret doesn't understand. I ate my oatmeal and kept my face calm. Survival means not begging to be believed by people who prefer easier stories. At noon, a nurse I hadn't met before came to my room. Her name badge said Lily. She held a small plastic cup with 2 pills. Time for your medication, she said. I looked at the cup. These aren't mine, I said. Janelle's smile was polite but stiff. They're prescribed. By who? I asked. Dr. Hensley, she said. My skin went cold. No, I said, I'm not taking those. Janelle's eyes narrowed slightly. Margaret, if you refuse, we have to document it. Document it, I said. Please do. Janelle's voice stayed calm. It's for agitation. I laughed once, very quietly. Not because it was funny. Because it was exactly what Carolyn warned me about. I said, I want to see the prescription order. Janelle's jaw tightened. We don't provide. I want it, I said, and I want Susan Keller contacted. Janelle froze at the name, as if she recognized it from a note. She said, I'll inform the nurse manager. Do that, I said. She left with the pills. I sat on my bed, hands folded, heart pounding. They were trying to medicate me into compliance. If I took those pills, I might slur my words in court. I might look confused. I might forget details. And David would sit behind his lawyer and watch me dissolve. I didn't cry. I wrote it down. Time, nurse name, what she said. At 2:00, Elaine came in with another woman, older, stern, with a clipboard. This is Mrs. Reynolds, our nurse manager, Elaine said. Mrs. Reynolds didn't smile. Mrs. Harlow, she said, we have an order for a mild sedative to help with anxiety. I'm not anxious, I said. I'm being held here against my will. Mrs. Reynolds's eyes flicked to Elaine, then back. That's a serious claim, she said. It's a true claim, I said. I want the order in writing, and I want to speak to the prescribing doctor, and I want it documented that I refused medication I did not consent to. Mrs. Reynolds's lips pressed together. Your power of attorney consented, she said. My power of attorney may be fraudulent, I said. Elaine's face tightened. Mrs. Reynolds studied me for a long moment, measuring whether I looked reasonable. Finally, she said, "We can schedule a care conference with your family." I said, "No, I want a hearing." Mrs. Reynolds's eyes sharpened. "A hearing." "With a judge," I said. Silence. In that silence, I felt it. The moment the story moved from facility gossip to legal risk. Elaine swallowed. Mrs. Reynolds said, "Who is your attorney?" I didn't answer, because even saying Susan's name in this building felt like placing a target. Mrs. Reynolds watched me, then nodded once curt. "I will note your refusal," she said, "but understand if you become disruptive." "I won't," I said. She left. Elaine lingered. Her eyes looked tired. She whispered, "Mrs. Harlow, why are you doing this?" I looked at her. "Because my sons are stealing my life," I wanted to say. "Because I'm not done being a person." Instead, I said, "Because I'm telling the truth." Elaine's throat bobbed. She left quickly. That night, Carolyn knocked on my door. It startled me, because no one knocked here unless they wanted something. I opened it slightly. Carolyn stood there, eyes sharp. "They tried to drug you," she said quietly. I stared. "How do you know?" Carolyn's mouth tightened. "I have ears." I stepped back and let her in. She looked around my room like she was checking for cameras. Then she leaned close and whispered, "You need to be careful. They'll call it behavior. That's how they justify locks." I nodded. Carolyn's eyes flicked to my Bible. "You're the one with the lawyer," she said. I didn't deny it. Carolyn said, "Good, because I'm going to tell you something you need to understand." She sat on the edge of the chair without asking. Her hands clasped tight. "My niece didn't just sell my condo," she said. "She put a lien on it first. She borrowed against it while I was still alive." My stomach tightened. Carolyn continued, "By the time I fought it, the money was gone. The judge said it was complicated." I whispered, "I'm sorry." Carolyn's eyes didn't soften. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be ready." She stood again. At the door, she paused. "Your son, David," she said. "He's the kind who doesn't stop when you catch him. He stops when you break his hands." I stared at her. Carolyn opened the door and slipped out, leaving her words hanging like smoke. 3 days later, Susan came to see me in person. She arrived in a gray coat, hair pulled back, carrying a legal pad like a shield. Elaine escorted her to my room, face stiff. Susan didn't look at Elaine. She looked at me. Her eyes took in my posture, my face, my steadiness. Then she nodded once, satisfied. Elaine said, "You have 30 minutes." Susan smiled politely. "Thank you." Elaine left. Susan sat close and spoke quietly. "We have a hearing date," she said. "Friday, County Courthouse, Judge Alan Whittaker." My stomach clenched. Susan continued, "David has retained counsel, a man named Robert Klein." I stared at her. "Of course he has." Susan nodded. "He filed a response claiming you're suffering from cognitive decline and that Rosewood Pines is necessary." I felt my throat tighten. Susan leaned closer. "Margaret, I need you prepared for this. They may bring in Dr. Hensley to testify." I whispered, "He never examined me." Susan's eyes held mine. "Then we expose that." I swallowed. "How?" Susan tapped her legal pad. "We subpoena records, appointment logs, billing, notes. We ask who was present. We ask why you weren't informed. We ask why there's a sudden prescription for sedatives." I felt the fear tighten into a hard knot. Susan said, "David will try to make you look emotional." I almost laughed. "I am emotional," I said. Susan's voice stayed calm. "I know, but in court, emotion is treated like instability. You will have to be steady." I nodded slowly. Susan said, "Tell me about the will change again. Exactly." I did. Susan listened, then nodded. That will is valid, she said. But be aware, David may argue undue influence. I stared. From you. Susan's eyes stayed steady. From anyone. He will try to suggest you were manipulated or not competent. The room felt colder. I whispered, he forged a power of attorney. Susan nodded. And we will argue that. But Margaret, be ready for this. If the judge believes even a fraction of their narrative, he may appoint a neutral guardian. A neutral guardian. A stranger controlling my life. My stomach rolled. Susan said, which is why your testimony matters, your credibility. I nodded. Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. She placed it in my hand. Keep this, she whispered. If David speaks to you, record it if you can do so legally. Pennsylvania is a two-party consent state, so do not record phone calls without consent. But you can document. You can write. You can ask staff to put things in writing. I closed my fingers around it. Susan stood. Friday, she said. We will request the court order your release pending investigation. Pending investigation. Not freedom. Not yet. Just a crack in the cage. Susan left, and Elaine escorted her out. I sat on my bed and stared at the courthouse in my mind. The wooden benches. The seal on the wall. The judge's face when he decided whether I was a person or a problem. That night, David came. Alone. No Thomas. That alone told me something. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment, looking at me like I was a piece of property that had started talking. You hired a lawyer, he said. I didn't answer. David stepped closer. His voice was quiet. You think you're clever, he said. I looked at him. I think you're a thief. His face twitched. Then he smiled. You changed your will. My heart tightened. He didn't know. He was guessing. Fishing. I kept my face still. Did I? His eyes narrowed. He said softly, Thomas told me you called a lawyer. So Thomas had cracked. Or David had pried it out of him. Either way, the secret was bleeding. David continued, you don't get to punish us because you're lonely. I stared at him. You did that, I said, not me. David's smile vanished. He leaned in, voice low and controlled. If you go to court and you accuse me, I will destroy you, he said. I held his gaze. Tell the judge I wander, he continued. Tell them you get confused. Tell them you're afraid. They'll put you in a locked unit and you'll never see that little granddaughter again without me allowing it. My throat tightened at Lily's name, though he didn't say it. He didn't have to. I whispered, you're not God, David. He stared, then laughed once quietly. No, he said, I'm just the one holding the keys. I felt my fingers curl around the small recorder in my pocket. I didn't turn it on. Because Pennsylvania law. Because he knew the law better than I did. He straightened. I offered you comfort, he said. You chose war. Then he walked out as calmly as he'd walked in. The door clicked shut. I sat very still. And then, because I had no choice, I began to plan like a woman stranded in the woods with one match left. Friday came gray and cold. They transported me in a facility van. Elaine rode with me, silent, hands folded. I watched the town through the window. The diner. The church. The courthouse growing larger. My hands were clasped in my lap, so tightly my knuckles ached. When we arrived, Susan was waiting on the courthouse steps. She looked at me and nodded once. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and floor polish. We walked down a hallway lined with bulletin boards and framed photos of past judges. Every face looked stern. We entered the courtroom. I hadn't been inside one in years. The benches were hard. The ceiling high. The judge's bench like an altar to decisions. David was already there, seated with his attorney, Robert Klein. Klein had silver hair and a red tie, the the kind of man who looked like he'd never been told no. David wore a navy suit. Thomas sat behind them, alone, shoulders hunched. He looked up when he saw me. His face held something I couldn't read. Regret, fear, or calculation. Susan guided me to our table. She whispered, "Remember, calm, answer only what's asked." I nodded. My throat felt dry. The bailiff called the case. Everyone stood as Judge Whittaker entered. He was in his late 50s, heavy-lidded eyes, face unreadable. He sat. We sat. The clerk spoke. And then the legal machine began. Klein stood first. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth, "we are here because Margaret Harlow is no longer capable of managing her affairs safely. Her sons, acting out of love and concern, have placed her in a facility appropriate to her needs." He turned slightly, gesturing toward me as if I were an exhibit. "She has become forgetful," he continued. "She has had falls. She has demonstrated agitation and paranoia, including false accusations of forgery." False. The word made my stomach twist. Klein went on. "We will show the court a valid power of attorney and medical evaluations supporting placement." Susan stood. "Your Honor," she said, "we are here because Mrs. Harlow has been deprived of her liberty based on documents she did not knowingly sign, and because her sons have acted with financial motive. Mrs. Harlow is competent. She is clear, and she has been threatened into silence." Judge Whittaker looked down at his file, then up at me. His gaze was not cruel. It was tired. Like he'd seen too many families tear each other apart and didn't believe anyone came out clean. He said, "Mrs. Harlow, you will have the opportunity to speak." My heart pounded. He turned to Susan. "Call your first witness." Susan called Elaine. Elaine walked to the stand, swore to tell the truth, and sat with her hands folded tightly. Susan asked her about my admission. Elaine answered carefully. "Yes, my sons brought me. Yes, paperwork had been completed in advance. Yes, I requested copies." Susan asked, "Did you hand Mrs. Harlow her records when she requested them?" Elaine hesitated. Then quietly, "Yes." Susan asked, "Were those records removed from her possession by her son David?" Elaine's eyes darted toward David. Then back to Susan. Her voice was small. "He took them." A murmur ran through the courtroom. David's face didn't change. Klein stood for cross-examination. His tone was gentle, almost kind. "Ms. Elaine," he said, "is it possible Mrs. Harlow became upset and you were trying to de-escalate?" Elaine blinked. She wasn't yelling. Klein smiled slightly, but she was insisting, "Correct." Elaine swallowed. "Yes." Klein nodded, as if he'd proven something important. "And is it true that residents sometimes misunderstand their needs when they're anxious?" Elaine's cheeks flushed. I suppose," she said. Susan's jaw tightened, but she stayed calm. Then Susan called me. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the stand. I swore to tell the truth. I sat. The microphone in front of me looked like a small black eye. Judge Whittaker watched me. Susan asked me my name, my age, basic questions to establish who I was. Then she asked, "Mrs. Harlow, did you willingly agree to be placed in Rosewood Pines?" "No," I said. My voice sounded steady. Susan asked, "Did you knowingly sign a durable power of attorney granting David Harlow authority over your affairs 8 months ago?" "No," I said. Susan asked, "Do you believe the document is forged?" I looked toward David. He stared back, expression blank. I said, "Yes." Klein stood for cross. He approached slowly, like a man approaching a skittish animal. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "I'm sorry you feel frightened." "I'm not frightened," I said. "I'm angry." A flicker crossed the judge's face. Klein smiled gently. "Anger can be understandable, but it can also cloud memory. Isn't it true you have had trouble remembering dates?" No, I said. Klein's smile stayed. Isn't it true, he said, that you fell last year and struck your head? I fell, I said. I did not strike my head. Klein nodded, as if taking note. And isn't it true, he continued, that your sons have been handling your bills? No, I said. David has tried too. Klein leaned in slightly. Why would your sons do this if not out of love? I stared at him. Because that question is designed to make you sound crazy if you answer honestly. I took a breath. Because they want my house, I said quietly. A murmur again. Klein's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite an accusation. It's true, I said. David asked about realtors. Klein turned his head slightly toward the judge. Do you have proof? I swallowed. Not yet. Not the way the court wanted. Klein's voice softened. Mrs. Harlow, he said, is it possible your grief after your husband's death has made you suspicious? I felt a heat rise behind my eyes. Not tears. Ray. But I kept my voice calm. My grief made me see clearly, I said. Klein's smile tightened. He stepped back. No further questions, he said. Judge Whittaker looked at me. Mrs. Harlow, he said, do you understand what these proceedings mean? Yes, I said. He nodded slightly. Klein called Dr. Hensley. When Dr. Hensley walked in, my stomach dropped. He looked like any small-town doctor. Gray hair, glasses, clean hands. He swore to tell the truth and sat. Klein asked about the evaluation. Dr. Hensley testified calmly that he had assessed me and noted cognitive decline. He said he recommended memory care. He said it was in my best interest. Susan stood for cross. Her voice was quiet, precise. Doctor, she said, when did you evaluate Mrs. Harlow? Dr. Hensley gave the date. Susan asked, where did the evaluation take place? In my office, he said. Susan asked, do you have appointment records confirming Mrs. Harlow was present? Dr. Hensley blinked. I would need to check, he said. Susan held up a subpoenaed record. She had it. She said, Doctor, according to your own billing records, the appointment on that date was billed under a different patient name. A ripple through the courtroom. Dr. Hensley's face tightened. Klein's posture stiffened. Susan continued, Doctor, did you personally administer the assessment? Dr. Hensley swallowed. My nurse. Susan cut in, still polite. So you did not administer it? Dr. Hensley hesitated. Not personally. Susan asked, was Mrs. Harlow in the room with you at any time? Silence. Dr. Hensley's eyes flicked to Klein. Then quietly, I don't recall. Susan nodded. Doctor, she said, is it possible you signed a letter prepared by someone else without verifying the underlying facts? Dr. Hensley's jaw clenched. Klein stood. Objection. Judge Whittaker held up a hand. Answer, he said. Dr. Hensley's voice was stiff. It's possible. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, heart pounding. Because that was it. The crack. The proof that paper could be dirty. Susan continued. Doctor, did you speak with David Harlow prior to signing this letter? Dr. Hensley hesitated. Yes, he said. Susan asked, did he provide information about his mother's condition? Yes, Dr. Hensley admitted. Susan nodded slowly. And did you verify that information with Mrs. Harlow? Dr. Hensley's face reddened. No, he said. Silence settled over the courtroom. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly. Klein's face was tight. David's expression stayed blank, but I saw his hand clench once on the table. Susan sat. Klein tried to recover by calling the notary, Patricia Grady. But Patricia Grady did not appear. Klein told the judge she was unavailable. Susan stood and asked the judge to compel her appearance. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed. He looked down at the file again, then up at David. Mr. Harlow, he said, stand. David stood smoothly. Judge Whittaker's voice was calm, but heavier now. This court takes allegations of fraudulent documents seriously, he said. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, David said. His voice was steady. Too steady. Judge Whittaker looked at him a moment longer. Then he said, Mrs. Harlow, do you wish to return home pending further investigation? My throat tightened. This was the moment. The moment that should have felt like relief. But my mind flashed to the porch step Carolyn warned about. To the loose steps. To accidents. To David's threat. To my empty house, possibly already in motion. Locks changed, valuables gone. Going home might be freedom. It might also be danger. Susan turned slightly toward me, eyes asking without speaking. I could say yes. I could say no. Either answer would cost me something. I looked across the courtroom. Thomas sat behind David, face pale, eyes fixed on me. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. Thomas wasn't just watching. He was waiting. Waiting to see which way the wind blew, like he always had. Waiting to see who would win. Judge Whittaker waited. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint scratch of a clerk's pen. My voice, when it came, was quiet. I want to go home, I said. David's jaw tightened. But, I added, and the word hung in the air like a warning, I don't know if home is safe anymore. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned back, considering. Susan's hand hovered near my elbow, steadying without touching. David's attorney cleared his throat, ready to argue. And I sat there, under the seal of the county court, realizing the worst part wasn't the nursing home. It was what my sons had taught me about love. Judge Whittaker said, Mrs. Harlow. And I watched his lips form the next words, not yet knowing whether they would open a door or close it. Because the truth is, even if I walked out of that courtroom a free woman, who, exactly, would I be walking back to?